we're going to do first is show this short film that Harry made for the Loewe talk he did the other week at Collect in London. But Harry, do you just want to say hi so we know, because we just had a problem with the sound a little bit earlier, but can you hear? And you can.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, brilliant. So, thank you, Harry. So we're just going to show this 3-minute film, which I think gives a brilliant overview of Harry's practice in his own words. So, Helen, if we could click that on, and then we'll go into conversation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Harry Morgan, an artist and maker currently based in Cheshire, just south of Manchester. I was a finalist in the Loewe Craft Prize 2019. For the past several years, I've been developing a sculptural series that combines commonplace materials, glass, concrete and pewter. I'm interested in the idea of dualism and the interaction of opposites, the relationships between the robust and vulnerable, transparent and opaque. Combining two materials in one object highlights their qualities through contrast. The sculptures have controlled angular forms, but the overall composition is determined by the unpredictable interplay between the materials. The use of glass in my work was inspired by the ancient glassblowing technique Marini, where glass threads are individually pulled by hand from a furnace and then used to create patterns or motifs within miniature tiles. As a student studying glass at Edinburgh College of Art, I was drawn to the optical qualities of the glass threads, and the fact that they were something I was able to make with my limited glassblowing skills. Individually, the glass threads are fragile and brittle, but collectively they are strong, and they have the capacity to support a large amount of weight. Following my graduation in 2014, I worked as a casting technician for a concrete fabricator in Edinburgh, where my main role was the research and development of concrete mixes and finishes for designers. I'm fascinated by the use of concrete as a craft material for both its rich surface potential and its cultural connotations. It's a controversial material and evokes strong responses, predominantly in the field of architecture. The pairing of glass and concrete is far from unfamiliar. They are the two most important and ubiquitous man-made materials ever invented, with heritage that span over 4 millennia. The sculptures are made through a combination of old and new processes. Once the glass is arranged into a structure within the mould, the concrete is cast over it, binding the threads together as one object. The casts are left for 2 to 3 weeks to cure. The amount of curing time not only affects the strength of the concrete, but also the depth and variation within the surface. After demoulding the objects, the concrete is ground and polished to achieve the final form. The concrete is sometimes acid etched to change the tones and texture within the surface. Many of these finishing techniques cross over between both glass and concrete mediums. The loose threads are removed from the object, and the remaining glass is UV bonded at the base. By juxtaposing these materials and processes, I aim to create objects with a sense of harmony and balance. I've been fortunate enough to be able to continue working throughout lockdown, developing a series of 2D concrete works, looking at the effects of temperature and curing time on the patina of the material surface, and I hope to exhibit these in 2021.
Brilliant, thank you for sharing that with us, Harry. I think it's a really beautiful, thoughtful film, and it's such a kind of insight into your work. But what I kind of wanted to ask is how you first encountered glass, and what led you to deciding to study glass at Edinburgh College of Art. What was that initial journey?
The first time I used glass was actually in high school, which is quite unusual, but our art teachers at high school invested in the kiln. And so when I was 15 or 16, they bought a kiln, and they didn't have any glass training, so we used to melt things in the kiln. They would get scrap glass, and it was very trial and error, and we would, we didn't really have much training, but it was experimental and playful, and we would just Yeah, I started off there, and I really took to it. So all of my art projects, my GCSE projects, my A-level projects had some component of glass in. I enjoyed, the melting things and the fire and the risk and the anticipation of opening the kiln. And I took to it. And my art teacher at the time showed me the course at Edinburgh. She found it, and I had applied to university to do something else, but she said, I think this would be good for you. And she loved Edinburgh as a city. I'd never been. So she showed it to me, and I went to an open day. I applied to Edinburgh, but I didn't get in. I was rejected, and then I took a year out and worked for my dad on a building site for a year, sorted out my portfolio, and reapplied the next year and started in 2011.
And actually, thinking about that was actually quite fortuitous that year out, because we'll come on to it more, but that's where you first encountered concrete, when you were on that building site and actually had it in your hands and could smell it and work with it. And so I suppose if that wasn't for that year, you might not have encountered concrete in those early years, or is that a possibility?
Probably not. I didn't work with it myself, but I watched it. I watched all of the groundwork, and I watched it being used, self-leveling cement, and that was kind of like my first exposure to it. So I watched and I observed. I didn't work with it myself. I still didn't understand how it worked, but it was kind of my first exposure to it.
So it was a kind of concrete as a kind of for building, for architecture, for foundations. So then Edinburgh College of Art, and then it seems to me you then did a residency in Australia, so all the way around the world, and this residency was quite intense. It was quite traditional. It really honed you in kind of skills of making, and then you returned to Edinburgh, and that's where it seems to me that journey there and back and that time in Australia kind of teased a lot of ideas in your head about making and the use of glass. Is that right? This kind of you came back.
So Australia, they have quite a famous glass department, and I did 6 months. It was a university exchange, and they've got a course that's led by Richard Whiteley, who is a famous glass caster, and they have Nadej, who is a famous glass blower, and they've both worked under quite well-respected glassmakers. So I went there in third year, and their third year is it's structured and it's very technical. So you have 1 day a week casting, 1 day a week blowing, 1 day a week cold working, and there's a real focus on the traditional skills. So I learned a lot technically when I went over there. And then when I came back in the summer, I got a bursary to go to the Northlands Glass Centre, and I did a masterclass with Richard Slee, who is quite a wild ceramicist who makes very non-functional, like sculptural works, often with found objects. So the masterclass was basically using found objects and making sculptural works alongside glass. So really stepping away from what I've been doing in Australia, which is very often like very functional glassware. And that was the first time I'd kind of seen glass, or was interested in using glass as a sculptural material. And and that I don't know if you've got the image, but the satellite was one of that was one of the objects that I found. I found a satellite in a field, and I had to try and think about how to incorporate glass to it. And obviously it's full of thousands of little holes. So that was when I first, I'd seen a glass blowing demonstration in Australia, a Marini glass blowing demonstration, which is a traditional Italian glass blowing technique where they pull these stringers or threads. So I helped out with that process, and it was something that I was able to do. So when I found the satellite, that was when I thought that I could incorporate the glass threads to it.
Maybe we should say that Northlands is in Caithness, in a small village called Leibster. So this is in kind of northeast Scotland, and it's flat, can be windy, big sea, big horizons, and this is where Northlands, a centre for glass, is based. So did you find the satellite dish on the beach, or?
Yeah, I found it in the field. We had a lot of fun. Yeah, he's quite a wild personality, Richard Slee, and yeah, we had a good time. It was a really good week, and we went looking in fields for found objects, and finding like sheep skulls and litter, the satellite. We did a trip into town and just went to charity shops. We had a budget of £10, and we were allowed to buy whatever we could get or whatever we wanted with £10. And Richard Slee's got a bit of a obsession with noses because he doesn't like his own nose, and he came back with £10 worth of fancy dress fake noses, which he used for his project. But no,
yeah,
it was.
He had an exhibition not so long ago at Tramway in Glasgow where he works in ceramic, but there, as you say, there's a playful but also kind of slightly defiant element to his work. Would you agree? So he sounds like the perfect person for a masterclass to kind of tickle and question your assumptions about a material and think of new ways of making and looking. Was that how it kind of a sense of liberation from traditions, or?
Yeah, it was exactly that, because he didn't have much experience in glass either. He was a ceramicist, so he was learning about glass at the same time. And Jim Maskery from Sunderland was the technician, so he was the glass blower, and he was kind of making everyone's ideas for them. And he'd worked with Richard before at Sunderland, and they'd made like a body of work together. So then at Northlands, Jim was the technician making the work for everyone, but also Richard was kind of learning and experimental as well. And yeah, it was very playful and not very serious, and kind of, but also, I think a lot of the people that were on there made functional glassware, and so yeah, it was a completely new perspective for me, and I think for everyone on the course. And he's a fun guy as well, so it was a good week.
And then going back to Edinburgh College of Art for your final year, and this is where your tutor is Jeff Mann, and this is your degree show. So do you want to talk us about how then, over those kind of that month, or those months and years, how this idea of the sculptural element of an object and this melding of kind of concrete and the glass. Have you got the glass strands there? Because I think it'd be kind of these.
Yeah. So so yeah, basically most of my time is spent kind of getting these clean and snapped into size and arranged into the structures within the molds. Some clear ones there, and this is the coloured glass, which is made by Bullseye, because it's kind of transparent. I don't know if you can see, but to make transparent strings is quite difficult to do by yourself unless you melt a whole furnace, because you have to dilute the coloured glass with clear glass to make it tinted. So that's kind of hard to do by yourself. So yeah, these are bought from Bullseye's, the colour called bronze.
And these are like glass straw, so they're like a very thin straw. So there's
yeah. They're very thin and fragile, and they snap very easily. It was a technique that was used for Marini, and then basically with the threads you would create a pattern within a mold, and then you could heat up that mold, melt it, and extrude it, and then cut it into not thousands, plenty of tiles. But I just think that just by themselves, I was interested in just.
When did you first think, because you've always been quite candid in saying that you're not a glass blower, but this is one thing you could do, and then we saw it in the film, this kind of looked like a wonderful thing of kind of trailing lines of glass along the floor. So you felt this is something that you could understand and do and make. Was that you felt that you could literally handle and understand and make. But then when the collection of these straws then actually had great strength. So how did that curiosity, I suppose, prompted you to kind of think more about these glass strands?
Well, I was taught how to do it in Australia. There was a demonstration, a Marini demonstration. So all of the students spent a full day pulling thousands and thousands of stringers in different colours. So we all did that together, and it was something that we could all do. And then we kind of created our own design. And yeah, just aesthetically, just when they're all grouped together before they fuse, I just think that they're very complex, and the way they play with the light, I just think I was aesthetically drawn to them. So then when I first started working them at the Northlands Masterclass, and then when I went back to ECA, Jeff had already been there for 6 months whilst I was in Australia. So those were my first lessons with Jeff, and all of his projects were kind of, so before Jeff, I'd had Alison McConaughey, who was a really great glass blower, and she went to RCA, and she was very, she respected the heritage of the material and traditional techniques, and she made vessels, kind of sculptural vessels. And then when Jeff came, he was more interested in pushing boundaries and pushing the students out of the comfort zones and doing new things with glass and incorporating other materials. And so a lot of the projects were collaborations with other departments. And when I got back, there was a project between architecture, textiles, and glass, which had happened over the summer whilst I was away. But my flatmate and my friend, I think's in the talk, he'd been in the exhibition, and I helped set it up. And yeah, that was the first time I'd seen concrete used as a sort of sculptural, artistic material, and that had been very experimental. And yeah, that was the first time I'd seen it used in a sculptural way. And I think, I didn't use it straight away, but it kind of, it registered in the back of my head. And then later on in a project, that was when I decided that I wanted to incorporate concrete. But I didn't know anything. I'd seen it used, but I didn't know much about it. So Jeff told me to go and speak to the technicians in the architecture department. So I went to their sort of research lab where they have a concrete casting area. Most of it led by someone called Remo Pedrecci, who's kind of like a concrete genius, and he kind of runs that lab. So they taught me how to mix concrete, how to make molds, and it kind of went from there, really.
I think what was amazing, then you, again, very fortuitous, you were new designers in London with ECA, and then you met somebody called Martin Fear, and then I love the way that the travel here. Then you were in Wales at Caerphilly for a year working with their company, which they were on kind of concrete. It wasn't quite a year, was it? How long?
No, it wasn't a year. So he went to New Designers. He had the concrete factory in Cardiff, which was owned by his dad. So he's like a concrete enthusiast. He was the president of the UK Concrete Society, and he went to New Designers. Invited. There was 5 students at New Designers that were working with concrete. So he invited us 5 to his factory in Cardiff, and most of the work they made was construction based. So it was lintels, windowsills, kind of mass produced things for construction. But he'd recently made the sculpture for Andy Goldsworthy at the White Cube. He made like this big sort of cubic, I think it was like 5 tons or something crazy. I think their factory had made that for him, so he became interested in working with designers and making things that weren't necessarily for construction. So he basically was really generous and offered us 5 students. He said, if you've got any projects that you want to work on, or if there's anything that you want to make, then you have access to our factory and you can come down here. So shortly after graduating, I got approached by Keston Hare, who's in Edinburgh, a fashion designer, and he wanted some pieces to use for a photography shoot and to put in his shop. So I hadn't made anything on this kind of scale before. So I spoke to Martin, and Martin wanted to do it. So I went down to the factory in Cardiff, and I was there for 2.5, 3 weeks, working with their technicians, and basically made these sculptures that you can see, which were so this was the first time that I was shown how to introduce like a foam core which would reduce the weight. So the cubes are 70 by 70 centimeters, and the triangular pieces are 1.5 meters tall. So even though they've got a foam core, they were still 250 kilos each. So they were kind of, I thought they were going to be a lot lighter than that. So basically, once they were used for the photography shoot and went into Keston's shop, I couldn't do anything with them. We couldn't get them out of the shop. So I think they're still there in Shoreditch. Yeah, so I learned a lot about concrete and casting, and yeah, that was kind of a big step forward.
At this point, where you're still thinking about working with both glass and concrete, because you often talk about you like the robust, and we always, as we say, associate concrete with buildings, with 20th century brutalism, and the fragility of glass. I mean, it is those things that are opaque and are transparent. Is that something, that tension between these two materials, that you kind of were increasingly becoming engaged and curious and interested in kind of exploring and pushing? Was this kind of all happening at this time when you're becoming more confident with using concrete for the first time, really, getting to know how to cure it, how to work it, how that it kind of lives and breathes in itself as a material?
Yeah, I mean, at uni, I was, the fact that glass is transparent is it's kind of mind blowing. The fact that it's made out of silica, and I just found it really interesting that concrete and glass are made out of the same thing essentially, but they're so different in their material qualities, are so different in the way that we respond to them culturally, and aesthetically. There is you have an understanding of the material, so just understanding that the glass threads are fragile, and as children we're told to be careful with glass, and we're scared of it breaking, and there's sort of a precariousness around it. So that, yeah, I was always interested in that tension of making things that were precarious and a little bit dangerous. And
was there any questioning of, as you say, taking concrete and crafting it and using your hands and molds to, were there any questions along the way that you shouldn't be using concrete, that it is something for the built environment? Did you find that there was anybody saying, well, actually, why concrete? Maybe pewter, yes, but why concrete? Did you find that there were any kind of pros or questions that people were wondering, or was there kind of people were equally excited by bringing these two similar but very different elements together?
I suppose it's not often seen in craft that often, and I guess after I did that work in Cardiff, Martin Fair introduced me to John Gray in Edinburgh, and the way he works with concrete, I suppose, was very different, and that kind of he was a lot more sensitive to it aesthetically, and new ways of working with concrete and surface quality, and because he was making things for designers and clients like Paul Smith and lighting designers, and so that, and yeah, he really does treat it as a craft material. So working with him kind of made me realize its potential, and how the nuances of how you treat it, like how soon you get it out of a mold, whether you put 26% water content or 28, and all of these things, and new chemicals like plasticizers, which is a new technology which is kind of changing the way that concrete works. And he introduced me to all these things, and I just thought there's so much variation. It's kind of I do almost see it a little bit like ceramics. You know, you can get such variation from, you know, it's one material, but depending on how you fire it, how you build it, how you glaze it, you can get such different qualities with it. So that I suppose that's when I became more focused. Working with John is when I became more focused with concrete and glass, I suppose.
Can you show a couple of those images? Do you think that those other works, just to, and maybe just talk how a little bit more on that process of melding these two materials, and the element of risk, and kind of letting your, both the glass and the concrete kind of, yeah, meld together, but that sense of not quite knowing.
Yeah, so this piece, so essentially what happens is I build an internal form, which is basically made out of expanding foam. So I build a mold for the expanding foam to fit the shape. And then I structure the glass in a sequential structure around this foam. And then the outside of the mold is built up and the concrete is cast on top. And at that point, you don't really have any control over how, you know, the interface between the two materials is kind of, it's unknown and it's unpredictable. You can subtly change it, but that's kind of the excitement for me. And especially when I started working on larger scales, there's quite a lot of risk because, you know, the glass is expensive and it's very time consuming and labor intensive to build a mold and to place the glass inside of it. So it's always quite an intense experience to cast it because there's quite a lot of at stake, and you know, a lot of the time they burst and the piece can't be used, and then if it can't be used, then you have to spend a long time taking out the glass and cleaning it and recycling it. And so yeah, it's still an exciting process for me, and there's still, you know, even though I've been making similar kind of work since 2014 or 15, the process has changed quite a lot because I struggled to, at first I was struggling to make pieces that that were structurally sound, but also kept the kind of raw nature of the process. So for a period I was casting resin on the bottom, which made them completely structurally sound and logistically a lot easier. But basically, they lost an element of their rawness, and so yeah, it took me a long time of experimenting with ways of, you know, making objects that were exciting and had that raw quality, but also, you know, I could ship them somewhere and they wouldn't end up in pieces when they got there.
And so that idea or decision to leave resin, and so at the moment at the bottom these separate strands that kind of are fed into the concrete, and that, because just looking at that image, then it kind of, thinking of watercolors actually, which are obviously a very different, watercolor on paper, where you get that sort of way, that seepage often, or when some artists, you know, how they kind of maybe roll the paper so the watercolor kind of pools at one moment and then kind of spreads and absorbed in the paper. I had that real sense of, yeah, and particularly with the blue ones, kind of the tide, the beach, the sea, the rock. So I think that unpredictability is what is so engaging about the work, and that's brilliant. And it obviously is still for you. Do we want to just move on to the next slide, Helen? Just to, yeah, I kind of, again, what I think is, you know, the materials that you are, is pewter, glass and concrete. This was, you've got such a brilliant curiosity about process. And this, maybe talk about this kind of collaboration with a foundry up in Fife at Lochgelly, Andrew Lang and Co. The central piece was shown at Design Exhibition Scotland in 2018. Do you want to tell me how this project came about and meeting up with Andrew Lang?
Yeah, so I met Andrew. I was looking for foundries in Edinburgh because I had the metal and glass pieces I was making. So I was looking for a foundry to make these, and Langs and Sons was the closest foundry to me. So I went and spoke to him, and it was basically a 100-year-old foundry. Andrew Lang is the great grandson of the founder, and basically it's been passed through the family, and the skills have been passed on. And it's the ancient process of sandcasting. But so I spoke to Andrew, and he was up for making the sculptures. So I was making these the metal and glass pieces, but I got to watch a lot of the sandcasting process. So I spent quite a lot of time in the foundry and getting to know Andrew. And yeah, the skill level was just amazing. The kind of the things that they make by hand. It's basically like building intricate sandcastles, which you then cast metal into. So at that time is when I met you, Susanna, and you were just starting Design Exhibition Scotland, and you were interested in what I was working on or what I was doing at the moment. And we spoke about the foundry, and you told me about Des. So with that funding, I spoke to Andrew and asked if he was up for doing something different. And I was interested in, challenging his skills and making complex shapes that he wasn't really used to, and then casting concrete into the sand and seeing what kind of result that had. And he was, he was more than game to show off his skills. And
I would always remember that day that we went up to the foundry, and Andrew's enthusiasm and interest was just brilliant. It was contagious, and I agree. I'd never been to a foundry before, and seeing the sand casting, and obviously the feel, the heat, the thrill, the drama, the light, the dark. I mean, intoxicating place to be. And actually, I sent Harry, if you go to the National Library of Scotland, they've got various archive films, and there's one on a foundry that was in Falkirk, but it was about an hour long, wasn't it, of casting and how you make rivets and everything, and it was totally fascinating. And I knew it would please Harry, and you were, but it is the laboriousness and the attention, obviously not only to detail but to size and millimetre. But the central piece, and as you just saw from the photograph, Lion and Turnbull, where the exhibition was, is a neoclassical early 19th century building. And the echo here of obviously the columns, and the view behind the work is looking up onto Carlton Hill and the national disgrace, or the kind of reenactment of the Parthenon. So this kind of wonderful, and then with the kind of 1960s lampposts on either side, like kind of guards of the building. And I loved the resonance of this piece and the kind of classical order. And it was brilliant, Harry, and to have it outside as well.
And also the process, it did kind of unexpected things, like you kind of see around the base there's a bit where the concrete kind of flared out, and that's always, these accidents and physical unplanned things, and letting the material, where it pushed out against the uncompressed sand was a nice detail. And yeah.
Maybe just then move on. At this time, I mean, there's lots of exhibitions. You would have received the Crafts Council Hot House programme, Inches Carr Graduate Award, so exhibition at the Scottish Gallery, and then we're now moving to Design Exhibition Scotland in 2019. And again, this is your ode to pewter. And maybe just say a little bit about pewter, because pewter, there's not much pewter in our lives anymore, really, is there? So maybe just how you became engaged with pewter.
I first used pewter at ECA. We did a collaboration with the jewellery department, and it's yeah, it's known as Pullman silver. I just think it's a beautiful material, and you can work with it at really low temperatures. So where, you know, silver and bronze, you're looking at sort of 600-700 degrees, 800 degrees to cast it. Pewter, you can cast it like 200 degrees. So I made these with a camping stove and a pan in my studio.
Really one of those little kind of Bunsen burner that you can make a cup of tea with, really.
I did set the fire alarm off at Custom Lane once, which is very embarrassing. And the fire engines had to come, but they're very understanding. But yeah, no, I like the fact that I could work with it myself, so I could experiment with it in an inexpensive and affordable way. It's a lot cheaper than a lot of other materials, and yeah, it has a long melting point. So when it's molten, it stays molten for quite a long time, so you have quite a while to work with it. So yeah, so then that kind of, I was playing around with it and those vessels, and then I learned through researching pewter that they think that pewter was actually invented in the Bronze Ages when, because bronze and pewter basically are both made up of copper and tin, just in different ratios. So bronze is predominantly copper with a little bit of tin. And they think that pewter came about by accident when the alchemists were mixing, or the founders were mixing copper and tin, and they put too much tin in the mix, and instead of it turning out to be bronze, it came out as pewter. So again, it's kind of similar to the glass and the concrete being made up of the same substances, but by subtly, you know, changing the ratios, you have a completely different material with different qualities and different kind of, you know, social perceptions. So I was interested in that, and then from that Design Exhibition Scotland project, I then fed into my glass and concrete, glass work. Because the other thing about the fact that pewter has a low melting point means that you can introduce it to the glass without it shocking the glass or causing stress or breaking the glass or melting it. It can kind of just fit around it in the same way that the concrete did. So that's when I began making this series of works, which combined.
It's like a helmet almost. There's a kind of curve at the top. Is that something because pewter is more malleable and that you can actually kind of handle it in a different way? Is that at a lower temperature?
Yeah, it's very, very fluid. So because it has such a low melting point, it's very it has a very low viscosity, which works ideally for me when it has to drip down in between the glass to fuse it all together. That actual top curve was bad maths on my part because when the pewter went in, the air didn't have anywhere to escape to, which is why you have this kind of line around the top where the air couldn't escape, and I had to fuse some more metal to it. But yeah, and that little dimple at the side was where my mold, the silicon, I hadn't made the mold completely uniform, and there was a thin part of silicon. So when the heat touched it, it sucked it in, and you get that beautiful little dimple, which was probably my favourite bit about the piece.
So again, saying that the unexpected, the hot air was expanding and it had nowhere to go, the mold. So it's those chance encounters and that often create what, because I so like that kind of curve, but that was bad maths rather than
yeah. I mean, I like it. I would do things differently. I am working on some new pewter pieces with different angles, and but you know, I like that piece, and I like, you know, that's, you know, I couldn't do it.
What height is this, so people get an idea of this must be?
It's 60 centimeters tall. I've got it upstairs. I could get it.
Maybe we'll go. Harry's probably going to take us we're going to be zoomed around his newish studio. But maybe this is the point where we should go on to the Loewe Prize, which was 2019, and the piece, and maybe just say the Loewe Prize was launched in 2016. Loewe is a kind of very well established leather Spanish company that an Irish, Northern Irish designer, Jonathan Anderson, is now creative director. And I think it was very much his impetus and his idea to launch the Craft Prize in, say, 2016. And Harry was selected and given a special mention for the exhibition in 2019. It's huge, it's international, it's hugely prestigious, and it really has made its mark as celebrating craft. So this work was shown out in Japan, and this process, this surprised you as well in the making of this piece. And maybe just say the height again, so an idea of its.
Yes, so this is kind of the largest, one of the larger pieces. This is 95 centimeters tall, and when you're working on that scale, it's kind of the weight and the pressure of the concrete is kind of tenfold. So the molds have to be a lot. They have to be reinforced a lot more. So I've got one here which is a similar sort of size. I don't know if you can see that.
Where is it?
You see it with the ratchet straps.
Oh yes, yeah.
So that's 120. So that was one of the earlier pieces that I'd made of that size. And what happened was I didn't reinforce it enough, and the mold burst after I cast the concrete. So the concrete started leaking out the bottom, and I kind of, it was one of those devastating moments where I thought because it had been about 2 weeks worth of work at this point to get the glass into size and to make the mold and to arrange the glass and to build everything and get it ready to cast. And I was really excited about casting it and really excited about seeing it. And then after I'd poured all the concrete in, I just heard the sound of movement, which you shouldn't be able to hear. You shouldn't be able to hear any wood moving. And then it just slowly.
Was it the wood that was kind of cracking? What was that?
So I hadn't supported one of the joints enough, so it slowly started and once the concrete starts coming through, you can't really stop it. It's damaged limitation at that point. So rather than wanting to clean it up from the floor, I put a ratchet strap around it and just sort of closed it. So it's kind of like sticking a plaster on a bleeding wound. And then so I just kind of, I cleaned up and went home devastated and just thought, well, that was a waste of time. And then I went back, I left it for about a week to cure. And then when I took it apart, what had actually happened was the concrete had separated the glass. I don't know if we can go back onto that image. Yeah, so the concrete had kind of worked its way down to the bottom of the glass, and you can see where it was seeping out at the bottom. But actually it was structurally sound and had made an aesthetic kind of component that I wouldn't have been able to make if I tried. I've tried to do it since and I haven't been able to. So it was one of those fortunate, happy accidents that I just fell in love with and decided to submit that as my piece to Loewe. And yeah, I was kind of pleasantly surprised when they accepted it.
So with the concrete, so there's seepage through, so when that creaking that you could hear and you put the ratchet around it, so what was, and that time that you left it to cure, the concrete was had shifted down, and is it layering the glass strands? And then did you have to, has a glass been displaced internally?
So it basically, there was more room. It's kind of hard to explain, but there was more room at the top of the glass than there was at the bottom, which is why it's kind of pushed out in this V shape. There was more room for the glass to be pushed into at the top than there was at the bottom, because the mold wasn't precise. And then, but I thought I thought that the concrete had covered all of the glass and that it wouldn't be used. But actually, what it kind of did was like Moses just sort of parted the seas and just moved down a hill. It was just very lucky, and I opened it and I just loved the piece when I took it out, and it was just I was very happy with it.
No, it's totally, it's beguiling and beautiful and intriguing, and the way this kind of the meeting of these two materials. So just we're nearly at the end of this, but do you want to just now kind of just looking at my notes, do you want to now just talk about this year, because as we started the talk, that you left Edinburgh just about a year ago as we were going into lockdown, a big fan, Leith Walk, and then you were looking for a studio for 6 months, and you've now found this studio compared to the studio you had at Custom Lane in Leith here in Edinburgh, which was kind of cupboard shared with 2 other people. And now you've got this great expanse. So how has it been? And you're doing much more drawing. You've had time to explore. What is your thinking process been over this last 6 months of catching your breath?
So I moved back in March, which was I'd been planning to move back for a couple of months, and it just so happened to be the week that lockdown started. So I didn't have a studio space. I had a space to put my work where I was able to do a little bit of work, but I didn't have access to it all of the time. So I basically went 6 months without access to a studio, as a lot of people did in lockdown. So I kind of, I took space from making these sculptures, and I was, doing gardening and kind of things like that. But I got really back into drawings at university. That was kind of, I was still drawing, but more in sort of a technical sense of figuring out molds and kind of thinking through the process. But during lockdown, I got back into drawing, doodling and drawing in abstract ways and kind of thinking of new things and new ideas. And that was a part of my practice I was happy to go back to. And I had the open project funding from Creative Scotland, which kind of got put on hold because of COVID. But Creative Scotland basically, I got funding to extend my trip to Japan from Loewe for 3 weeks as a research project. So because obviously Japan's famous for its use of concrete, and famous architects like Tadao Ando, who I absolutely love. So I went on a bit of a Tadao Ando pilgrimage, and bringing that back, I took hundreds of photos of the concrete Japanese lampposts, which were kind of decayed and textural and like kind of painted. So for my open project funding, I decided to make design some concrete lamps, which I don't know if we got the drawing.
Yeah, this is interesting now that the sculptural objects, and how you talked in the beginning of wanting to use glass and concrete in a sculptural way, and now this something that is resolutely sculptural and functional. Is that something you've been thinking about for a while, and then still incorporating or still working with concrete?
I guess at the start, you kind of, when you graduate, you kind of trying to figure out, labeling's a big thing. It's like, do I label myself as a glassmaker? Am I an artist? Am I a designer? And sometimes you can get a little bit too hung up on that. But I just thought that I thought it was fitting. The thing that I was interested in was the lamppost, and I thought, is there a way of making something sculptural that was kind of fitting with those? And I know I spoke to you as my mentor about potentially making lighting, and if that was going to impact, you know, how people saw my sculptural work. But no, I don't think it does, because it was basically something that I wanted to see. I wanted one myself, and I think that's a good enough reason to make anything. So yeah, that's the next on the agenda that I'm working on at the moment.
And you've got an exhibition coming up at Make House on Earth in Somerset, and you showed there last year, and I just managed to get to see that mid unlocking, and that's this summer as well, isn't it? That you're going to be showing. Is that going to be the pewter work that you're going to mention?
Yes, I'm making some new pewter and glass pieces, but I'm also making some concrete vessels, which is kind of like a new thing that I've just been talking about. You know, the curing time and treating concrete with just water. You know, putting water on the surface when it's fresh out the mold and it's curing can, you know, it almost stains the concrete, kind of like, you know, like a glaze or an acid. Or so I've been making small concrete pots and staining them with water, basically, which
how does
more
that
just
just say a little bit about the curing that people understand, because you think of curing meat, but what's the curing process? And again, you've talked about, I used the word a couple of times, of why that is required, and what is happening to the concrete during that process.
So essentially, concrete, the least amount of water that you use in your concrete mix is the stronger that the concrete is. So if you use, the more water you use, the less strength it has. So it's about finding the balance between, because if you don't put enough water in, it's not workable, and you have like a thick blob of something that isn't going to fill your mold. So it's about finding the right balance, depending on how intricate your mold is, of water content so that you have the workability, which is kind of where this new technology of plasticizers, super plasticizers that John Gray taught me about. And the super plasticizers basically, they take away the friction between the particles of the concrete, so they allow it to flow with minimal water content. And then once the concrete is cast and it's in the mold, the longer you leave it in the mold is the longer that it retains the water. So and that gives it more strength, and it also affects the surface quality and aesthetic. And so yeah, and there's so many variations, you know, whether you take it out 1 day or 2 day, or I'm kind of doing a little sample test here, which is I have these kind of little strips of wood, and I take one off each day to kind of see the different, you know, so for example, I could take that off now. That was tomorrow's. But
the wood is leaving obviously unexposed to the air. Is that what you, why the...
Yeah, so that surface still retains the water, because essentially when you take it out of the mold, then the water evaporates from the concrete, and what that can do is it can leave voids. It leaves voids where the water was, which are basically weakness points in the concrete. So yeah, the longer you leave it in, the better. But also, because my work is sculptural, it's not really, you know, I'm not building buildings, I'm not making things that rely on intense strength. I'm more interested in the surface quality and the aesthetic than the structural integrity.
I would just say, if anybody has to go, and say just a huge thanks to Harry for being so generous with and candid about how you work and the risk and the sense of adventure, and just be so generous. Thank you to Helen over in Glasgow, Vote as ever, for helping, steering, co-piloting. Thank you everybody for coming along and for your support. Brilliant. This is our last talk in this series of studio visits via Zoom, but do go to our website and catch up. But thank you so much for all your support. But big thanks to Harry. And we'll be